Good Monday morning, everyone. It is the final Monday in the month of January 2021. Look how quickly 2021 is rolling out. Welcome to Perspectives for this morning. It's a new day, new week, of course, fresh perspectives, and we are here with you. Welcome to those of you joining us on air on MTV and online on MTV's Facebook page. The Facebook pages of Perspectives, Partygrenada, TNR Communications, Mikey Live, and Sister Isles Radio in Carriacou. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I am Brenda Baptiste, and say good morning and welcome to our expert talk panel, Senator Christopher de Allie and Mr. Byron Campbell. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning, Brenda.
What? You all sound like a choir.
And good morning to our viewers and listeners as well.
How was the weekend?
Mine was quiet. Not too much activity this weekend. I was all transfixed this week, watching the inauguration of the new president in the U.S. and
yes.
the new vice president, of course, and a history-making event. So I suppose that dominated the news in the early part of the week.
Indeed.
And all of us have been taking note of what is happening in that big place. On the local scene, not much. I suppose we're still getting over the finding of our folks who disappeared.
Yes.
Unfortunately, most
painful.
of them passed, but
Yeah.
So it was a quiet week, I thought. Politically as well, you haven't heard any news-making events in the parliament or so?
Oh. Oh.
I just said, Byron must have heard things I don't. I mean, Byron has heard things I don't hear.
No,
So.
well, morning. For me, what stood last week was the NGOs and the church had a first consultation on the decriminalization of marijuana.
Yes.
Considering the Caribbean Community CARICOM Regional Commission and the recommendation, I think it's an important first step in going forward, because when you looked at the I don't know what the attendance was, because I know part of it was on Zoom, and there's going to be a report on it as a first session, coming out of it. But I think it's important because, just to highlight what the Commission, in fact, has recommended and what the Grenada is considering, that for the declassification of marijuana as a dangerous drug in all legislation and the reclassification of the drug as a controlled substance in this report presented to the CARICOM heads. That was since in 2018, I believe, in July. But they're looking at the findings, and I think it's very clear in going forward. So I think this is an important and interesting development for us here. I think. Additionally, we start talking about the continued curfew that we have. I have noticed a lot of more young people are finding it, having difficulties with it, putting it frankly. But personally, again, my perspective on this is that when you look around, Chris, and we're talking about that around us in terms of St. Vincent and Lucia and other territories and the wider world, this is a serious pandemic. I don't want us to think we can, we're okay. We're not okay because our borders are porous and are open. So that vigilance, that discipline, I think is important, and we have to be consistent with it. For me, it sends a kind of signal. I think we've been toying with the time from 8 to 10, 10 to 12. We can do that, but I think that serious signal must be continuous, that this is a serious pandemic. It kills. We don't have the resources to manage it if it really takes us.
Yeah. I certainly support the fact that we need to understand more clearly, especially with what is happening in Trinidad. Just had a new variant identified in their environment, so we need to be careful. And the new variant seems to be causing a lot of interest. When you heard the last report out of the UK and what is going on with the new variant, it seems so. There's no need, we can't drop our guard. Put it that way. So. I don't know if the curfew, there will be a lot of debate on the curfew and its control of groupings and people's behavior, but it certainly gets people home at a certain time. Although we see a lot of violations. I could tell you, been driving through places like Marion and Monjolu and library, and you see guys.
But that means you breaking it also, Chris.
No. I am going through at about 10 to 10, going home, and you see.
Well, when you pass, they may
shops-
be inside.
No. The shop's open and guys playing domino.
Maybe they're
and-
sleeping by the shop.
Well, I didn't think about that. Or they're sleeping in the shop. I don't know,
Yes,
but
10 o'clock, they close the door,
yeah.
lock down.
But these facilities seem to have a different view of 10 o'clock.
Yeah.
And what you're addressing there is really what it is. Mr. Campbell, you mentioned young people seeming to have a problem with it.
Yeah.
I mean, I am not a young person.
Yeah.
I am young, yes, but I'm not I don't consider me a young person.
Yeah.
All right? But it is troublesome to many. There's a psychological aspect to this thing. I mean, the 8 o'clock was really driving people crazy, but we had to understand it wasn't a time. We had a cluster at the establishment in the south, and we had to do what we had to do. Now we're at 10 o'clock. More restaurants and hotels and so have tried to keep their doors open to at least bring some employment. So that sort of balance as well. 10 o'clock is not bad. What we're having is people asking the question, okay, so what's the rationale? We only have 4 cases, we only have 11 cases. Why we still have the curfew? Right, exactly. But, as you rightfully say, we still need to maintain our state of vigilance, because one of the things I think we can credit ourselves for, and we can continue to credit ourselves for, is the early steps we took during the pandemic. Yeah, because it could have been a lot worse. So it's just a constant balancing of it. But at the moment, 10 o'clock is okay. 12 midnight, good. But 10 o'clock is okay. Because, I say 10 o'clock, 12 midnight, iffy, because we really have to look at the other factors impacting. It's not just that we only have 11 cases or 4 cases and just open up. So I guess that's what, but then there's so many things. I mean, we don't wear the crown that's so heavy on the head of the Prime Minister, but there are so many other things to consider and must be considered, because mind you, there are some stakeholders in this country that figure once they say close 8 o'clock, all of us should go inside 8 o'clock,
Yeah, well, I mean...
And that's just because of their convictions. But when you're leading, it cannot be just the convictions of one grouping. It has to be a total consideration.
And you're so correct on that. I mean, there's so many other factors to consider when you're making these decisions, whether it's how we control borders, the porosity of the borders, and what is happening to us regionally, and what is happening. I mean, if there was a control in all the countries very close to us, and I mean, the real one here now is St. Vincent, and what is happening in St. Vincent. St. Vincent had, more than 57 cases in one day, and they're up to 700 plus cases. I mean, St. Lucia, sorry. And St. Vincent continues to register in the high 600s. I mean, so you have to really be concerned as leaders how, and the possibility of these things continuing to, affect what you do. And I understand, I mean, when you hear the reports about Wall Street this weekend and other places in Granada and so on, there are a lot of people there at close to 10 o'clock.
Yeah.
And I mean, the idea of...
They're sleeping there.
And I understand the balance between, people need to make a little money, and I understand the frustration that people need to get out as well and have some, release some fun. It's not an easy balance, and you have to commend our people, even though we getting frustrated, but we're still finding ways to relax, but we have to be careful not to push it as well.
We get the seriousness in it. By and large, I find we are pretty disciplined with it. We get, we of course when
we haven't heard the police come back with any major incidents and negativity of people obeying their curfew, and I suspect there'll be spots now and here and there.
And there are people who have said that they on the road. I mean, if they catch them at 10 o'clock, they have had good interactions with them. Why are you here? What's happening? There are people who have been on their way to hospital. They've been very accommodating and all of that. So that seems to be working well. That seems to be working well. So let's come. Barbados, yesterday, there's the CDC. They listed Barbados as level 4, which is pretty high.
And St. Lucia.
And St. Lucia as well. Yes, so
advising
So no need to let our guards down. Brenda, there's two other things I'd like to raise briefly this morning here.
What's that?
The first is last week, what we saw. I just want to big up NULO here. This organization is doing so much positive work for young people in terms of skills, CVQs, and training for employment. And the record is excellent. And I just want to say that last year, the SIDE program has a relationship with them through an MOU where, last week they got a disbursement of over $250,000 to continue the work that they're doing. But the results is excellent. And I think that young men, young women. The other thing I want to raise here, and again, the farmer's pitch on Monday morning, is that one way of beating this COVID is to build your resilience, by being healthy, vitamin C. And this is the citrus season now. So we want the nation to support farmers buy local citrus. Don't buy this box drink, There's a lot of local citrus on the market now. Get it, high vitamin C level. Use it, absolutely. Chris.
He's a citrus farmer. So I hope the next Monday we see a little bag of oranges or so.
Coming for us, you understand?
So we can understand what's happening
thing in
here.
it too. Yes, boost the immune.
But I support that, 110.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I do.
Right.
I mean,
I buy fresh, I buy local oranges,
Right.
and peel and so on.
And it's the season, for the next 5-6 months,
I believe in that.
We have a
I
lot
don't
of
buy
citrus.
boxes at all. I don't
No,
I'm
no.
not interested in boxes.
The
we have a lot of
additives in it.
mandarin.
The additives in it is not
You
good.
don't have mandarin.
Mandarin, golden apples.
The
we
whole
have a
range
lot
of
those.
citruses around you're talking about. We do pretty good. Lemons, lime, orange, mandarin, tangerines, grapefruit.
But I think we need an invitation to the farm.
You understand? Maybe we should do a show from the farm one morning.
I think so. We need to talk to the producers. We need to go by Byron's farm.
So use local, use local, use local.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's important.
And before we introduce our guests, I'd just like to commend as well. On Friday, I was at work, so I just took in the marijuana, the discussion on cannabis.
Good, you didn't say that.
Kind of bit by bit. But on Saturday, I went back and I looked at it in its entirety. I must say congratulations to the interagency organizations, mostly civil society. There was a really good representation there. There were great presentations from the doctor who presented the report to the commission. Dr. Wendy Crawford Daniel, one of my favorite people, she was there giving the social side of it, which is so critical. Rastafarians were there talking about their experiences. One of the things that was eye-opening for me, and I never heard a position like that before, was when Bishop Harvey said that one of the things we never really consider is the use of marijuana as a weapon. And he cited in the Black Power movement, Black Panther and so on, and how marijuana was given to the black men to just chill them out so they wouldn't be so agitated in the protests and whatever have you. And there's so many sides to this thing, so many historical and contextual and scientific and social and historical things that we need to consider. So I would like to see those discussions continue. The minister was there as well, Minister Peter David, given the government's position and some of his as well. And the time is critical though. We do a lot of good things in Grenada, but we have to take into consideration a lot of things. Time of day, 9 o'clock on a Friday morning probably was not a very good time. So probably we have to look at, but that they started the ball rolling and that the discussion was so healthy, so edifying, and so it was great.
Good thing about coming late or last, whatever you want to put out, gives you a lot of perspective, say hindsight is perfect vision. So it kind of gives you and see all the experiences of countries who have gone before you.
The horse is out the stable. We have to move. Right. So this morning we have a very, very special Grenadian with us. He's been in private practice for the past 24 years, focusing on criminal, civil, and constitutional law. Managing partner of Siboney Chambers for the past 20 years. He's a former president of the Grenada Bar Association, 2000 to 2008, and from 2014 to 2016. Former president of the OECS Bar Association, 2012 to 2016. Current president of the Organization of Commonwealth Caribbean Bar Associations, that's the OCCBA, from 2018 to 2020, now serving his second term. The OCCBA is the umbrella body representing bar associations from the Bahamas in the north to Guyana in the south. He's an active member of the Constitution Reform Advisory Committee, which led the work for the November 2016 Grenada referendum, and of the CCJ Advisory Committee, which led the work for the November 2018 referendum to determine whether Grenada should join the appellate jurisdiction of the Caribbean Court of Justice. He appeared at all levels of the court, including the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in London, admitted to the bars of Grenada, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, St. Lucia, Dominica, Antigua and Barbuda, St. Kitts and Nevis, the British Virgin Islands, the BVI, and the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. He's currently the president of the Grenada Chess Foundation, and he's an attorney at law, a devout, patriotic Grenadian. We say good morning to Mr. Ruggles Ferguson. Good morning.
Good morning, Brenda.
Good morning.
Good morning to your panel, such an esteemed panel. Probably I must say the Larry Kings of Grenada. Yes. Thank you for having me. It's my first appearance on this program, and thank you for inviting me, and good morning, listeners and viewers.
Right. So, Ruggles, this morning, you're here, if you want, you don't mind us calling us you Ruggles. I know you don't like the Mr. Ferguson bit. You are here in your capacity as a constitutional guru, a title aptly given to you by our good friend John Anthony Rollo, but nonetheless deserve it. So Grenada continues to be under a state of emergency. And there is emerging a kind of tussle, if you will, people engaging about, their human rights, what's in the Constitution, who give the government powers to do this, who give the cabinet powers to do that, where's the GG? And there is some sort of people talking about like structural inequity, if you will. So the Constitution is being referred to, especially Section 17 of the Constitution, in these many arguments. So does the articles of the Constitution stand alone in this, or are there other legislative provisions that supports the actions of the executive?
Okay, Brenda, to answer your question, first of all, I probably would wish to, again, just look at the separation of powers, one, briefly, and the role of the main organs of the states. As is usually said, we have three organs. We have one, the executive, and that's cabinet, responsible for policy making. You have parliament, responsible for lawmaking, and you have the judiciary, responsible for interpreting the laws, the judiciary, the guardian of the Constitution. And so parliament, for example, can pass laws, as is said, for the peace, order, and good government of the country. Can pass any law. However, the limitation is that the law passed must not be inconsistent with the Constitution. And what's at play here in times like these are really fundamental rights and freedoms. Now, the first 16 sections of our Constitution, Chapter 1, outlines fundamental rights and freedoms. The ones we are most familiar with are freedom of expression, freedom of assembly and association, freedom of movement, freedom from discrimination, right to personal liberty. All these are fundamental rights and freedoms. Now, what you have with the emergency powers legislation is an interplay with all of these different arms of the state. So, for example, cabinet cannot make laws. They cannot make laws. Parliament makes laws. You may have delegated authority given by Parliament to ministers, like you have the Minister of Health, for example, under the Quarantine Act and under the Public Health Act.
Yeah.
The minister can make regulations. And then you have at play too, you have the Emergency Powers Act of 1987-88, and that act allows in emergency situations, cabinet to make regulations.
Right.
So sometimes you see, for example, the quarantine regulations, you have the public health regulations, and you have the emergency powers regulations. And the last set of regulations we saw in January actually are the emergency powers legislation. Now, cabinet would have a legislative agenda. Any new government coming into power would have a legislative agenda. Though they can't pass laws, they'll introduce bills in parliament, and these bills eventually become law if passed, and then you have gazetted, people are bound by the law. Now, under section 17 of the Constitution, I think that's where a lot of the debate emerges. The Governor General may declare a state of emergency. Now, in declaring, the word used is proclaim, that must be gazetted. So proclaim a state of emergency, it must be gazetted. If Parliament is sitting, then that state of emergency automatically lapses after 7 days, unless extended by a resolution of both houses of Parliament. Then you have the upper house, the Senate, and the lower house, the House of Representatives. If Parliament is not sitting, then it goes on for 21 days, and then after which it lapses, unless extended for 6-month periods by the resolution of both houses of Parliament, and it has to be a simple majority of both members of both houses of Parliament. So, for example, if it's in the upper house, you have 13 members, then you must have at least 7 consenting. So that's the context in which things are taking place. Now, the freedoms affected are mainly is mainly freedom of movement. Right? Freedom of movement. So what the curfew restricts would be freedom of movement. Between 10 p.m. and 5 a.m. you must be inside. So that's your freedom of movement. The Quarantine Act, for example, may interfere with your personal liberty. You say you land in the country, you can't go home, right? You must go, you quarantine somewhere. So the what the Constitution says is that, listen, there are all these freedoms, but no freedom is absolute.
Correct.
Right? No freedom is absolute. There's a limitation on each freedom. But the limitations must be justifiable. Right? And they must also be proportionate. Right? Proportionate. And what does the Constitution allow limitations for? Say, in the interest of public order, in the interest of public safety, in the interest of public morality, in the interest of defense, and in the interest of public health. So it says, listen, Parliament, generally you can't pass laws that are inconsistent with the Constitution. So you can't just pass laws to take away people's freedom of movement. However, you may pass laws to take away people's freedom of movement in circumstances where it's something that affects public health.
Right.
Because your individual rights are pitted against the broader interests of society. And that's why people are familiar with freedom of expression. They said, well, listen, I can say anything. It does not necessarily mean you can say anything. That's why there are defamation laws, for example. That's why there's obscene language, insulting language, threatening language. All of these are expressions, but there are limitations that the Constitution allows. So right now, really what the debate is about, what I have heard, and I can tell you I've not been really following the media much, but I have heard positions that say, for example, that with the last extension, I believe somewhere on the 11th, what happens somewhere about the 21st of December the Governor General proclaimed a state of emergency. That might have been the third one, because we had, I think, in March, and then that was extended for 6 months, and either that was the second or the third one. But a state of emergency was proclaimed when there was a cluster you referred to. Now, that, because Parliament was not sitting at the time, that state of emergency has a life of 21 days.
Right.
Now, apparently on the 21st day, the Governor General revoked that state of emergency, and then there was a third state of emergency declared. Then Parliament met within the 21 days, and both houses of Parliament approved a resolution to extend the state of emergency until July. Now, the extension that is permissible.
Right.
The issue of debate that I have heard is one, whether or not that extension should have been done between December 21st and January 11th. And could the Governor General have revoked the first state of emergency and just, in effect, extended for a further 21 days, consecutive days? So I have heard that as an issue. On a reading of 17(7) of the Constitution, one interpretation is that could be allowed, the Governor General can revoke. Another angle would be, listen, once you declare it, it's for Parliament to extend it. You cannot just revoke it, so you have like back-to-back 21 days. It's like you get
Right.
42 days. Because you had the first 21 days, and you extend it, you revoke it, and you extend it for 21 days. So that's, some people describe that as an unconstitutional extension.
Right, but under the Emergency Powers Act, though, because here's what we noticed, like it was like a fortnightly renewal when we were up in like March. It was being renewed like every 2 weeks. What is the difference with that now under the
You mean
public
the
health?
curfew?
Yeah.
Right. Again, to have a curfew, because a curfew restricts freedom of movement. Now, so there's a distinction between the emergency powers extending to July.
Right. So the
And the
emergency
curfew.
powers, let me just get it clear. So because we need to differentiate what is a curfew and what is a state of emergency,
Right.
and the act which enables same. So
Precisely.
the Emergency Powers Act brings into force a state of emergency.
Right. No, the proclamation by the Governor General brings into force a state of emergency,
Right.
brings into being a state of emergency.
Right.
But that can only last for 21 days when Parliament is not sitting.
Right.
Right.
Good.
So that's step one.
The curfew now. So what kind of instrument is the curfew?
Right. Now the curfew comes under regulations.
Right.
So for example, you have three things. One, the Constitution, which is the supreme law at the top, says we all have freedom of movement. So that's the first thing. Then two, you have acts of Parliament.
Right.
Now the very Constitution, remember the Constitution sets out the structure of the state. And the Constitution says there is an institution called Parliament, and Parliament may make laws for the peace, order, and good government of the country. Parliament over the years made 3 laws we can identify as relevant. The 1987 Emergency Powers Act. There was the 1947, I believe, Quarantine Act.
Right.
And then there was the Public Health Act that was amended from 1973 until I think there were amendments, recent amendments.
Yeah.
So these 3 acts.
Yeah, the last
No.
one was in September.
Right. Now, Parliament now, in passing these acts, also say, Minister, you have power to make regulations under the act. So the act won't cover everything. So regulations are made for the better performance and implementation of the act.
Right.
So the Constitution say Parliament make laws. Parliament made 3 laws: emergency powers, public health, quarantine. And under these respective acts, Parliament said to the minister, you can make regulations. So what comes into being here that we have changes to ever so often are the regulations made by the minister. Now, in order to sustain the curfew, you must have the state of emergency in place. But there's a distinction between the state of emergency and the curfew. So, for example, a state of emergency being extended after the 21-day expiry to 6 months, which is the maximum under the Constitution that it can be extended for, to July 2021. That does not mean automatically that the curfew is extended to July 2021. What it means is that between now and July 2021, if the authorities think that there should be curfew in place, then they will be authorized to make regulations to impose a curfew. So the 2 weeks you're referring to, sometimes changes are made to the time of the curfew. And so, for example, it was 8 o'clock, and then it moved from 10 to 5, it is still a curfew. And you need the regulations in place for that. You can't just say it and it has effect. There must be regulations, and these regulations must be gazetted. So that, and when it's gazetted, the amusing part is everybody is deemed to know about it, but nobody reads the gazette.
Well, this is 2021, so these are reformations that need to happen.
Right, indeed. Right. So that's why the interplay. Now, one of the debates, one of the live debates issues, really is the Emergency Powers Act itself. Now again, don't confuse the Emergency Powers Act, which is an act of Parliament. And Section 17 of the Constitution, which is a different document that authorizes the Governor General to proclaim a state of emergency.
Right.
The Emergency Powers Act now then supports the declaration of the state of emergency. In other words, what the Constitution is a small document. It just says the general things that can be done. But these things are fleshed out in acts of Parliament.
And that's why I asked the question, because it seems like we grab on to Section 17 of the Constitution and we're going by every letter in its literal sense. But that's why I asked the question, what other provisions or regulations are there in place to support what is happening? So
it's acts of Parliament and regulations. You have to look at all of them in their entirety.
Correct.
Right? So
and
you
how
can't
they
look at
intertwine.
Precisely.
Right.
And what is the role of cabinet? And you know,
that's a big question as well, where I point to, and that needs to be explained. Because I think that's where the anxiety is that the executive, aka cabinet, is just sitting there and just punishing us. So what is the role? What is the role of the cabinet?
And that's why I always say, Brenda, once people understand the separation of powers principle under the Constitution, then all of these things become clear. Because it's the Constitution as the supreme law that sets out a separation of a role for everybody. Now, what the Emergency Powers Act, no, not the Constitution, the Act, gives Cabinet the power to make regulations under the Act. So, for example, anytime you hear about curfew and changing the time for curfew, you don't look for that in the Public Health Act. You don't look for that in the Quarantine Act. You look for that in the Emergency Powers Regulations that are going to come. So if it's moving to 12 o'clock, look for Emergency Powers Regulations, because the Minister of Health does not have that power under the Public Health Act or the Quarantine Act.
Right.
However, if you want to know how visitors to the country are dealt with now, you have a virus, people coming from England, people coming from the States, and what are the regulations in place and what can and cannot be done, you basically look at the quarantine regulations for that.
Right.
Because there's a Quarantine Act that deals specifically with our ports of entry and how you control infectious diseases. So each has its role to play. I think one of the sensitive areas and an area ripe for debate really is whether the Emergency Powers Act, as it existed then in 87, was really to deal with public health issues, or whether it's really to deal with threats of insurrection, for example, where then these emergency powers can be put in place.
Right.
So, and whether it has just been extended to public health, so that's one of the issues. Now, all these issues are really debatable. What is critical is that once people understand the superstructure or the structure, then one will be able to contribute more meaningfully to a debate.
Yeah.
So, for example, as you were mentioning earlier, should there be a curfew or no curfew? Now, the issue is, yes, the state has powers pursuant to Section 17, pursuant to Emergency Powers Act, and pursuant to regulations to impose a curfew. The issue is now, should we have a curfew or should we not have a curfew? Because when you are dealing with fundamental rights and freedoms, it's all a balance. A balance between the interests of the individual, because these are individual rights, and the interests of the wider society.
Right.
So Brenda, from listening to Ruggles explain that, of course, I thought the Attorney General that sits now, Dia, did an excellent job in showing a similar thing, that the Cabinet has powers under the Emergency Act to do certain things. Ruggles just raised the issue of debate, whether those emergency powers is for wartime or if it's for normal times like public health emergencies and so on. But I think the word emergency is a broad word, and some people term COVID as a war. A war that we're in with fighting for life.
But I'll tell you something,
life.
gentlemen, interestingly, even in our very constitution and so on, that makes a reference to infectious diseases. You talk about malaria, they talk about, you find the word epidemic, you find the word endemic. Nowhere is the word pandemic.
Because the last
COVID is a pandemic.
Last time we had one with Spanish flu.
It's interesting.
But I think at the end of the day, we could get into a lot of debates about the law and the regulations. But what is most important to what Mr. Ferguson just mentioned is balancing your individual right under the Constitution versus the wider context of exercising that right and the danger or not of the country as a whole, and how you balance that. And that has to be the interplay of our leaders, how that balance is achieved. And if it concerns people's life, which is so sacred, and the possibility of protecting that versus not protecting it by enacting certain things, then I always believe we will go to the side of making sure people's lives are protected. So I hear this debate. I've been listening to some of the debates. But at the end of the day, for the ordinary man on the street, yes, the curfew affects, and as Ruggles indicated, it restricts your movement. But you have to ask yourself the question, in my view, whether that restriction of movement is going to protect you and your family and others.
Right.
10 days from now, 10 months from now, what is going to do? And then the question becomes, Ruggles, how do we get our people to understand? When you hear these debates, and let me contextualize it differently for you, and we hear the arguments being put forward by one side on the interpretation of the law, because you lawyers are very good at that, that we pass. You understand how you interpret it and the effect and the context of the interpretation, because all that is part of the interpretation, and the regulations that is done. How do we ensure that there is some level of balance when we take the country? And let us put this as protecting the people of our country. How do we balance that with possibility of people saying this is a wrong interpretation versus this interpretation?
Right.
Is that critical, or is the life and the protection of the people of the country more critical? That's a question to you.
So, well, I'm happy that you raised that point, because what I say is the interpretation, or what somebody else says is the interpretation. These are merely personal views. What the court says is the interpretation, is what matters.
Correct.
So, for example, it is only the court. That's why I started off with separation of powers. The arm of the state, the judiciary, the court, you bring a constitutional motion or you seek certain declarations from the court, then the court will pronounce accordingly. The court may agree with me, the court may agree with somebody else. And that's why I prefer to approach these issues, which brings me to the second point, which is really from a public education standpoint.
Exactly.
Because my view don't really matter.
Yeah.
My view may come about based on certain subjective issues and so. But when you're dealing now with interpretation, then you have to apply the rules of constitutional interpretation, and you have to go to the court with the necessary evidence and so, and then the court would pronounce. You have to go to the High Court. This is not something but the Magistrates Court or the High Court. And even though the High Court rules and you may be dissatisfied with it, you can go to the Court of Appeal, and then you may be dissatisfied. The Court of Appeal may rule one way, and you go to the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council. These are not easy issues. Like some people simply say, that's unconstitutional, this is unconstitutional, right? Now, it may be, right? And you may have a strong view. But even at the level of the Privy Council, you have had them sitting. The full 9 members, a usual panel will be 5. And they divided 5-4.
Right.
Or in the usual thing, they divided 3-2. These are supposed to be the best minds putting an analysis on the same issue with different results. So I'm saying these are not easy answers. What I always advocate is that you need to empower our people with the proper tools to analyze these things. And what is good about all that is happening now is that it encourages debate and an opportunity to learn more about our Constitution, to learn more about how laws are made, to learn more about the regulations. Because sometimes I hear people make comments and some misinformed comments with the passion that this is right and everybody else is wrong.
I think it goes to the point you made earlier, the difference between edifying and weaponizing. And those are done for different reasons, most of which we know.
You know, the 2 words, Brenda Ruggles, the 2 words that stuck out for me here in your elaboration on the matter is that those acts, those regulations somehow must be justifiable and proportionate. That's fundamental, and the question is, who decides that they are proportionate and justifiable, and what is the role of the citizen? But here's the thing, we have COVID-19, and I mean, the argument from the society, from some individuals, is that is it in fact a greater danger to our traditional illness, like pneumonia? The argument is that we have 60 deaths of pneumonia in the country per annum, and there is the question that is the government being, in terms of how it's acting and the regulations, are it moving in a totalitarian matter, you know? So what are the mechanisms for the citizens' rights under the state of emergency? I mean, you talk about the legal and drawn out and expensive, but proportionate and justifiable. How do we ensure that these regulations are in fact meeting these standards?
Okay.
That's the concern of the citizens.
Yes. And again, very important point. And I want to make the point that the Constitution itself provides the vehicle to the citizen for redress. So, for example, if a citizen feels aggrieved, let's say somebody is charged under a regulation that you think for some reason is unconstitutional, that citizen can go through section 16 of the Constitution. In fact, it said if your rights have been, are being, or are likely to be breached, then you can go to the High Court for redress, and the High Court can shape any remedy, including striking down the unconstitutional part of the legislation.
Okay.
So there's actually redress through section 16 of the Constitution. Now, that balancing act is where the challenge lies. Because now, remember, as I said earlier, you have constitutional rights and you have limitations on those rights imposed by the very Constitution. And therefore, the limitation we are dealing with here is a limitation with regard to public health. Say, yes, we restrict freedom of movement because of public health considerations. So when you limit it, if the Constitution says these are the 5 planks pursuant to which you can pass laws that limit rights, then it must come within those 5 planks, first and foremost. Your regulations must be, as the saying goes, rationally connected to what you're trying to achieve. So it can't be just arbitrary. I have the power to do it, and it's just, it must be rationally connected. And apart from being rationally connected, now all these are tests by the court. Is it proportionate, or does it go too far?
Right.
Right? A court has to determine that based on evidence. So the issue is always, when you're dealing with constitutional issues, and yes, there will always be breaches. So for example, with the Freedom of Expression Act, the right to freedom of expression pursuant to section 10 of the Constitution. The Libel and Slander Act of Grenada is an encroachment on that right, because you're saying, listen, if you slander somebody or if you libel somebody, you could sue them and that person can get damages. That is an encroachment on freedom of expression. But what? It is permissible. The law held that it is a permissible encroachment. Insulting language is an encroachment on free expression. Threatening language. But the law says it is a permissible encroachment. So curfews are encroachments on people's freedom of movement. The issue is it justifiable to achieve public health protection for the wider public? So that's the issue, and it must be proportionate.
Right.
So what I'm saying, and that's what I'm saying, what is important for the public are really the tools, because what's my opinion is just my personal opinion. I may be wrong. I can say on the face of it, it's an encroachment on fundamental rights and freedoms, and therefore there are certain things that need to be done, and that's why you have to look at the legislation.
Yeah.
You know, for example, Chris mentioned earlier on about St. Lucia. St. Lucia, now, St. Vincent has just come from nowhere. I believe there might be around 700 by now, just nowhere and pass everybody. And they're about to pass St. Lucia. I was reading last night, you had the 11th death in St. Lucia yesterday. Now we were talking in St. Lucia recently when there was a big thing when the first person died. A big issue, one person, now 11 people. So the question, one of the questions that needs to be asked, again, should we be reactive? In other words, wait until it happens and then do it. Or should we be proactive and try to prevent it? And that's now, so therefore should there be no curfew at all? Because as a colleague Prime Minister said, well, hey, What?
Nicodemus.
Yes, and moving in the night.
Yes.
Right? Which I thought was a very unfortunate statement.
Yes.
There, because around Christmas time, you know, you have people socialize more, go to parties, and you know all of these things. So really and truly, should you have it at 6 o'clock? Should you have it at 10 o'clock? Should you have it from 12 o'clock, midnight? These are the issues, and probably, you know, because COVID is a common enemy. COVID is a common enemy.
Correct.
COVID does not see political color.
No.
And therefore, we all have an individual and collective responsibility to protect society. And therefore, in this debate, it should be a constructive debate that seeks to either educate or advise on measures that we could all collectively take to protect ourselves.
Not
but once you make that political, COVID in looking for political color as to who to, right? And you know, you may register criticism and be vocal and everything. But we have to try to be as constructive as possible because it affects all of us.
Right. There's also the growing feeling, and that folks think that only those afflicted should be isolated, while the rest of us are allowed. Yeah, there's a lot of people that feel that way. Those who are afflicted, isolate them. And the rest of us should just be allowed to go on with our business. How does the regulations address that, though? Or how would in the law address that?
Well, when you have...
In terms of the threat of this public health phenomenon.
Right, so what the regulations do, so you have the quarantine regulations. And that speaks to people mainly coming into the country and what protocols must be followed, and the authority to quarantine, and so once you coming in, you have the public health regulations that address the general public health issues. For example, if there are signs of COVID, and so what could be done, what doctors can do,
wearing a mask and
these things. And then you have the emergency powers regulations, and they say with that again, you have curfew, because you can't only address curfew under emergency powers regulations, really. And all regulations, you don't have regulations for some people, and then it may exclude others. For example, essential versus non-essential workers as a broad category. But it's for everybody. So if it says curfew from 10 to 5, it's curfew from 10 to 5 for everybody, save for exceptions identified under the regulations. Right? So, and the regulations are important because you can't just make regulations or pronounce. Or even the Governor General can't just come and proclaim a state of emergency or a state of emergency orally. It has to be gazetted. Why? Because again, people must know about it. It must be written somewhere. And I think one of the shortcomings now, I've spoken several times about it, but to find some of these things, you can't find these regulations, even the basic regulations that guide people, and plus these things must be simplified all the time. So if there is no serious and sustained public education, anytime you interfere with people, anything that interferes with people's freedom, there is a natural reaction. And therefore, one has to first of all convince that there is an authority to do that. Your freedom alone does not matter. It has to be balanced against the wider society. I think once people understand these basic things, but nobody takes the time really to engage on that level. We tend to engage more on a political level, a partisan political level, on issues. And that's why I heard you mention new law. Byron mentioned Nulo earlier.
Yeah.
Nulo and these Grencoda
Yeah.
and these institutions, Grencoda I meant, not Nulo, Grencoda and these NGOs have such a critical role to play. As I always say, probably the most important role to play in times like these. Because you have to take the politics out of the arguments and deal with the issues as objectively as possible, while at the same time you criticize, right? The problem with our party politics, and there's no individual to blame because that's the system as it is. The role of the government is to beat the opposition, and the role of the opposition is to beat the government, right? And somewhere along in that beating, the vital message is lost.
The victims are us.
Right, precisely, because people are doing it purely from a partisan standpoint, and you have nobody now, from an objective standpoint, looking at things just purely objectively.
Yeah, it's something that I always say. I think civics in school could address from a level of, I remember in primary school we did a lot of civics. That's what kind of opened my eyes to things like politics, even before I got to do social studies.
Right.
So and have that sort of awareness, if you will. Because I was talking to somebody yesterday, and they were not even aware that there was a Public Health Act. There was a Quarantine Act of 1947. They were just arguing solely on the Constitution and what Section 17 says. And to speak to your point of the politicizing and what I would like to term weaponizing, because people are coming from different angles with this thing, is that if you are a person of influence, if you're an attorney, if you are a media house, if you are a person of influence, I think your role in a small society like this should be an extension of the civility, being correct on issues, not leading the ignorant, not deliberately misleading, not just riling up people, gassing. No, it's illegal, the state of emergency is illegal, the curfew is illegal, and you have people saying, the curfew is illegal. Well, go out and break it now.
Yeah, I was about to impinge on that point with Ruggles and his earlier conversation, Brenda, that the viewpoints of people, and I think Ruggles did it nicely. Your view is your view. Your opinion is your opinion. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's the correct one. But you never hear us express that when we're given our view. As far as we're concerned, our view is the right view, or the right point, or the right opinion. And we recently saw how that escalated in the U.S. People of influence sending messages to people who takes it in a different context and a different way, and weaponize it for want of a better word. And the question here, Ruggles, to you is, how careful as leaders of our country and leaders generally we need to be, what we say, how we say it, and the audience, because there are people, as Brenda had indicated, that are not clear on what really exists and have all the information on what can be done properly or not. So how careful must we be when we speak to an audience that includes anybody of all levels of intelligence, and ensure that the right message is communicated with some level of control? Because you don't want to send people down a rabbit hole and let them believe that all of this is just to impinge or create or punish or whatever, and as you say, take the politics out of it. How important it is for us as leaders to ensure that we communicate this thing effectively?
Well, as leaders, and I'm speaking generally, as leaders, see, we have to be responsible. We have, and I see probably leadership in a different way. Leadership is not about government. Leadership is not about opposition. Leadership is about all of us who can play a role. And we have to be responsible with that role. You see, too many times, people are into the popularity contest. So, for example, you want to say what the public is saying, or what is the popular viewpoint, so you will not become enemies of the public. that you might be popular for a little while, right? But at the end of the day, people respect you more when you say what it is, right? In other words, whatever your passion is, and if you feel, listen, we're going down the wrong way, then you say it. You don't say it's the right way because you want to please, especially the public. And most politicians will want to add to, debate that is rich. And at the end, people know, sometimes I admire callers who can call in and, speak because of the public education, and they have been following, different programs over the years. They show a knowledge of the Constitution and how it operates. And I think one of the things with constitutional reform, as I always said, even though ultimately it failed in that people didn't vote about it, but the society as a collective knew more,
an awareness,
at least, that there is something called a constitution and that there is a role that the constitution plays.
Seriously,
right? And that we don't refer to the constitution just for convenience.
Right.
Right? As many people do, it's a matter of convenience. But we look at the broad issues and the interrelationships.
Yeah.
And in this debate, we have to look at the Constitution, we have to look at the relevant acts of Parliament, we have to look at the regulations. And there may be things, and there are things certainly, I see, that can be criticized. And if there's anything that I would urge, not just government, but stakeholders, is to engage in the education of our people in relation to these matters. So at least we can have informed debate.
Indeed. As we wrap though, do you think that the time is ripe to kind of amend it? All that we're learning through this pandemic, as I said, the word pandemic is nowhere in any of these acts, the Constitution, nowhere. So we now have a pandemic, right? This was like 1973, 1947, wherever the last pandemic was 100 years ago. So all the things that, because remember, the Constitution had to be fit for living. The situation with the Gazette, how do we change, how we notify that this, because nobody in reading no Gazette, no way, not even me, right? So how do we put it on social media? Do we come and make an oral pronouncement? Does the Governor General stand in her office and we zoom in on her? She goes live and declares this thing. So all these little things that, how do we, are you seeing that we need to make some amendments because of what has happened in the last year or so?
You mean an amendments to the act of the Constitution?
To all of them.
Right. Well, of course. And what I want to say in relation to the Constitution is usually described as a living document. It's interpreted a bit differently from acts of Parliament, where you have strict interpretation.
But it has to be fit for living.
Right. So, for example, you mentioned that there is no mention of pandemic in the Constitution. In fact, the Constitution don't mention a lot of these things because it's like the guide, it sets up the structures.
Framework.
But it's a living instrument, and it's interpreted as the case law has indicated, in a generous manner to apply to the times. Right, to apply to the times. Whereas now, the acts of Parliament, you have different rules of interpretation. They are strictly interpreted. So, for example, the Emergency Powers Act of 1987-88, that should be amended to, in very express terms. You see, when you leave a lot of things for implication to be implied, then what happens? You have different debates, different people carry different positions. It must be clear. It must be clear that it can cover public health situations in a very express manner. I've looked at it and I think that it can be amended. And you have, for example, the Quarantine Act is a 1947 Act, right? The Public Health Act is just around those times too. Now, they have all been brought to life because of COVID. And the debates is all the richer. But people must understand the debates in context, not just about an act, but there is the regulations. So people say, well, hey, how come the minister, what kind of society is it, the minister making regulations and saying we can't do this, we can't do that? Yes, because the minister is authorized under the act
to do so,
to make regulations. And again, cabinet. Well, who running the country? Cabinet making regulations and cabinet saying that, you know, emergency powers, we have curfew and so. Because, why? The Emergency Powers Act say it's cabinet, is an entity, nobody else.
Correct.
Because that's the other thing. If the law says, identifies an entity to make regulations, then that is the only entity that can make the regulations. So for example, there's a quarantine authority identified under the Quarantine Act that can make rules. So the law says all of that. So I think what we need to do is really sensitize and educate people more.
That's it.
Because of the implications of this. This is not, it's just like about winning a debate. But as you said, it's about winning a war.
Yeah.
Because if COVID, I saw yesterday that there was community spread in Barbados.
Yeah.
And in St. Lucia too, 700 and something. And again, why? Because St. Lucia decided to open up early. Tourism is critical to the economy. They are thinking jobs. That is the balance now. Should we open now? Or should we wait a little while before we open? And you see what happened. St. Vincent, the idea of state of emergency and curfew and so, that's alien to St. Vincent.
Yep.
And now we see it's about even mask wearing. Yeah. That's not mandatory. Yeah. You may be advised. Yeah. Mask wearing is mandatory in Grenada. And not only that, there are penalties.
Yeah.
Right? There are penalties that you enjoy. So the question is, should we put these things early in place and prevent
yeah.
what can possibly happen?
Yeah.
Or should we wait and say, okay, well, 25 people dead, no, I think we need a curfew. 25 is a kind of lot, that justifies a curfew.
No, we don't.
Right?
So, you know, Brenda,
Thanks, Ruggles.
to wrap up on my opinion, I want to say this is my opinion.
You're right.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
That,
right.
you know, I'm heavily critical that countries like ours are always reactive.
Yeah.
We never proactive, we never take in front, we always react to situations. I must commend Grenada and the leaders for being proactive on COVID.
Seriously.
We have been very proactive on taking, some people may say draconian steps to ensure that as a country we protect our people, yes, at the cost of livelihoods in a lot of cases, but the issue is which one is more important. My opinion, life is more important in that sense. However, we must commend the proactive steps that were taken, and our figures are testimony to that being proactive. When you look at all around us, as Ruggles just point out, St. Vincent, St. Lucia, Trinidad, all of them, Barbados, all of them around us, we have done well in taking some of what the debate is now, whether we're infringing people's rights and we trampling people's rights and so on and so on. But we're saving lives, I think, because the current caseload in Grenada is 0 positive cases. You know, and most of it have been imported, barring the cluster we have. So I think my opinion is that we have done well to be proactive.
Yeah, the numbers, don't let our guards down. Wear a mask, social distance, hand washing, the basics, and
safely social distance.
Absolutely. You know, I am so much more informed as a result of this morning, Brenda. We have to have Ruggles back. I mean,
always.
Absolutely, a lot of information, and maintain our vigilance. It's important.
I think so many of us have learned so much from Ruggles in terms of things. Thank you so much. Always so generous with your time and information, and as a true good Grenadian.
Thank you, Brenda.
Thank you
You
so
never
much.
choice, eh? You never choice.
Thank you so very much. I mean, I remember the referendum. Ruggles just gave so much of his time. Him and Dr. Francis Alexis, they were the champions of this thing. And
then
so
some
many
people
people
think-
learned so
Yes.
much.
And others think that we lost, right? At the end of the day, I said, no, the process, it was a great
Yeah.
process.
Yeah.
People had an opportunity.
Yeah.
They made their choice. You have to respect the choice.
course, Yeah.
But at the end of the day, I see
country
the
won.
positive out of
Correct.
it, which is the public education. Eventually, we'll get there. At what point? Time will tell.
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's it's nobody lost really.
Yeah.
Loss and win is about egos. You know,
Indeed.
yeah.
Indeed.
What we did was
Indeed.
what we
Yeah.
did was national, was nation building, and less egos. We're in a good foot, so let's take in front. Let's continue and keep up the vigilance with the COVID. Of course, continue to safely social distance, wear your mask, and please obtain and try and your best not to break the curfew. Right? The police have been really good, but don't push them too hard. Right? And yeah, we see what happens. Okay, extension we can beg for, but we see what happens. Have a great week, everybody. Have a great week. We have great energy coming out of the United States, out of Grenada. Of course, our condolences to the families of the lady in Carriacou who was found, and they're still unearthing who is it at Mardi Gras, I believe. But folks do believe that it was the lady that went missing over a year ago. And must be tough for the families this morning. So our condolences and our thoughts and prayers are with you. Until our next Perspectives, I'm Brenda Baptiste, saying thanks to all of those who brought us up this morning, live and alive with you. Nazim Benjamin for our streaming services, Blondell George and Curl and the technical team, Richie Oliver, our executive producer, and who keeps us smiling, and Kishan Thomas, our producer, and Brenda. Bye-bye. Until next time.